deeply.
Okay, thank you. It's nice meeting you all. Thank you, Jean-Marc, for your invitation. Sorry for being late. So I will start with some introductory remarks. I think it's important first to distinguish between these three questions that are often confused: the use of armed drones, the practice of targeted killings, that's a policy, and the issue of autonomization. And the confusion between the first two, is extremely common. If drones now constitute something like the airborne image of evil, if it has become so accepted to oppose them in the media, in our discussions, without understanding anything about them, even sometimes, because after all, everyone knows that they're some kind of flying robots killing Pakistani children, it's largely because of its use by the CIA in Waziristan and to a lesser extent in Yemen and Somalia. And this policy of targeted killings, of course, is questionable. It's questionable morally as well as legally, and we'll explain that in detail, but the end and the means must not be confused. It is, of course, possible to pursue the same end. So it's possible to pursue the same end with other means. You can have a policy of targeted killings with airplanes, missiles, helicopters, snipers, commandos, killers on foot, etc., even polonium-210 that the Russians seem to appreciate. Think of the Russian dissident Litvinenko in 2006 in London, and maybe it's still unconfirmed, but maybe Yasser Arafat in 2004. To kill bin Laden, the US didn't use drones. Why? It was not to avoid collateral damages, it was to get intelligence. Over 6,000 documents were found in computers, USB keys, hard drives. You can't do that with drones. It was to make sure of his identity and his death, and to bring the body back, so the house of Bilal does not become a shrine. Conversely, it's possible to use the same means for other ends. You can use drones, of course, for something else than targeted killings. Targeted killings are highly publicized because it's the most controversial use of drones, but quantitatively it remains very minor in comparison to surveillance missions. Around 80 countries have now drones, but only 3 have armed drones: Israel, the US, and the UK. France recently acquired a weaponizable American Reaper, and the question will arise one day to arm them, so there is an internal debate today. I'm working on the French doctrine in that perspective. And next generation drones, UCAV, combat drones, like the American X-47B, the British Taranis or the French Neuron, they will necessarily be armed. But for now, the overwhelming majority of drones worldwide are surveillance drones that are not equipped with missiles, and only 5% of US drones, for example, are armed. Surveillance drones can actually help prevent combatants from attacking civilians. For example, in Libya, individuals using rocket launchers to fire on inhabited areas, as some pro-Gaddafi forces did, were identified as were arms supply depots by using French surveillance drones, and this information was then transmitted to fighter jets for airstrikes. And even when they're armed, they can help protect civilians. Suppose someone buries an IED, an improvised explosive device on the road, as often happens in Afghanistan. If you have an armed drone in the area, you can see it, identify it, and immediately strike it. The IED is thus located and neutralized. If there is no drone, you can't see the IED. Its presence is unknown, and when it explodes, there are casualties, and these casualties are not necessarily military personnel. Then we strike those presumed to be responsible, say the nearby village, chosen a little randomly sometimes, as did the US Marines in Adita in 2005. In a situation like this, an armed drone saves not just our lives, but the local population as well. Moreover, there is a legitimate use for drones in situations of armed conflict, which is no more problematic than that of airplanes and helicopters. That the pilot is not in the cockpit, but somewhere else on the ground, does not constitute a relevant difference in most of the situations. Many drone opponents are not interested in surveillance drones, but only in armed drones, and not even any armed drones. They're interested in armed drones used not in armed conflicts like Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, or Mali, but their illegal use by the CIA in the American policy of targeted killings, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia. In other words, what is presented to us as a drone problem is really a problem with a certain policy, an American armed military drone used by CIA for targeted killings. So that's a problem with the policy, and policy that is of course debatable, but to which the drone should not be reduced. So that was the first confusion. Not confusing between the means, the drone, with certain ends, like policies of targeted killings. Another confusion to avoid is the one between drones and little autonomous weapon systems, laws, that we call them now, like this, commonly known in the media as killer robots. According to widely used definition, little autonomous weapon systems, they're weapon systems that once activated, you have to precise once activated, because before, of course, the human intervention is everywhere, can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator. It's currently discussed, it was for the first time in Geneva, the UN at the end of May. I was part of the French delegation. It was very interesting to see how it was done. But it has nothing to do with drones, at least with current drones, because current drones are all piloted. And contrary to widespread belief, the absence of humans in drones does not make them unpiloted aircrafts. They are remotely piloted aircrafts, and even implying a lot of people on the ground. It's not because there is no human in the machine that the machine is inhuman. And unfortunately, many drone opponents use this homonymy sophism. The fact that in the machine there is no individual belonging to the human species does not mean that the machine cannot be the least likely to cause unnecessary harm. And that these are two different things with no logical connection between them. Paris metro trains on line 14 are not less humane just because they don't have a human driver on board. And robotic surgery is not less humane just because in some operations it means that the surgeon prefers remotely controlling a robotic device rather than putting his or her big fingers into the patient's body. On the contrary, robotic surgery is motivated by humanitarian, potentially life-saving considerations. The robotic device is more precise and less invasive, and the operation can be carried out at a distance. This homonymy sophism also occurs in the British anti-drone protesters slogan, "We don't want to lose our humanity." The humanity in question, the one we don't want to lose, is the humanitarian sentiment. And the contention is that drones threaten it because what? Because there is no human being in the cockpit. But there were humans in the Halifax and Lancaster bombers that attacked Hamburg in 1943 and Dresden in 1945, as well as in the Tornado aircraft that bombed Iraq, Serbia, Afghanistan, and Libya in the past 2 decades. And these British anti-drone protesters do not conclude that these British planes were more humane on account of being manned. Behind this homonymy sophism and the fallacious conclusion that drones are necessarily inhumane because they are unmanned is often the assertion that drones are necessarily inhumane because they kill. And this assertion is based on a naive view of ethics as a doctrine of the good, whereas it's rather a doctrine of the lesser evil, and a place in which there are moral disagreements, often tragic. Grégoire Chamaillou, for instance, the author of A Theory of the Drone, soon to be published in English, 2015, asks, how can we call methods designed to destroy human life humanitarian? In fact, no one says that drones are humanitarian. Many, including myself, do say that they can be more humanitarian than other weapons. And this is a very different statement. It's a relative position rather than an absolute one. Chamaillou cannot deny that there are degrees of humanitarianism in killing machines, what he calls killing machines, unless he treats all weapons as equal. Yet, international humanitarian law, IHR, distinguishes among them, forbidding some, permitting others, precisely on humanitarian grounds. Expanding bullets, chemical and biological weapons, landmines, cluster munitions are prohibited by conventions. Nuclear weapons, not expressly prohibited, have aroused and continue to arouse much controversy. This is because all these weapons violate fundamental principles of IHL, such as the distinction between civilians and combatants, proportionality, and the prohibition of unnecessary suffering. Moreover, if there were no such degrees of humanitarianism in different ways of killing, a principle like the prohibition of unnecessary suffering would never have come about, because it distinguishes between weapons that cause too much injury and others that cause only necessary injury. Assuming that Chamaillou supports these humanitarian principles, he has no choice but to recognize that some weapons respect them more than others, and therefore that it's possible to say that one killing machine is humanitarian in comparison to another. I will start with working on drone as a means, and then I will turn to targeted killings as a policy. So what's the specificity of this particular weapon compared to others? Because you can, of course, conduct targeted killing with other weapons. But this one is especially popular. Why? Well, there is a false specificity. It's being able to kill at a distance and without risk. That's what the opinion holds as radically new. The power to kill without fearing of being killed. The absence of risk reciprocity. The violation of Michael Walzer's rule at the time of the Kosovo when he said that, I quote, you can't kill unless you are prepared to die. Sheltered in the base of Nevada, the drone operator kills an Afghan insurgent 12,000 kilometers from there without being prepared to die. The drone then embodies one of the limitations of war, which no longer relies on the context of shared risk, but on the asymmetry. And that's where it causes moral outrage among drone opponents, who think that such a fight is not a fight, it's assassination, it's unfair. But is it really a specificity of the drone? Well, this is not new. As animals, human beings have an instinct for self-preservation. And as tool-making animals, they have always used their ingenuity to protect themselves while killing others. That is, to eliminate the enemy from a safe distance. We did that with javelins, catapults, bows and arrows, firearms, artillery, submarines, airplanes, missiles, and today drones and computers. We can talk about cyber defense as well. This behavior is universal. The drone is not the only weapon at a distance. It's just the latest. And this does not change the nature of what has been an asymmetrical conflict. The drone operator, that's true, is not threatened by the Afghan insurgent he's killing, but neither is the B-2 pilot dropping his bombs from 8,000 meters, nor the crew of a destroyer launching a missile 1,500 kilometers from the coast, nor that of a submarine hundreds of meters underwater. Remember that in 78 days of bombing and more than 38,000 missions, NATO suffered no loss over Kosovo in 1999. Invulnerability can be obtained with men in cockpits. It simply is much more expensive. The difference is neither that the risk taken with the drone is this time not even infinitesimal as it can be for pilots and crews in the area. You can always say that it's not zero, but absolutely non-existent. You can say it's zero if you're in a bunker in Nevada. First, it would still not be a specificity of the drone as the hierarchy, military hierarchy, in their offices in the capital, they're not taking more risk while taking little decisions. War has always been safe for some. And second, the risk is not zero. It's not zero psychologically. You've heard of the studies showing that drone operators are more likely than pilots to suffer PTSD and psychiatric problems. And it's not zero physically either. The drone operator, if his identity is known, is a terrific target for a terrorist attack. With drones now becoming airborne symbols of evil, crystallizing the terrorist desire of revenge, this domestic threat on drone operators is real. Third, those who speak of a non-existent risk artificially isolate drones from a complex system. Drones are not alone. They're often supported by special ground forces or allied forces, Pakistani and Yemeni, for example, even if they deny it, that risk their lives. And drones also come from a base in the region, which may itself be the target of attacks. Here, there's an important difference between the French and the Americans. French drones are operated in situ, on the spot. In Afghanistan, for instance, French drone operators were in Bagram, which was actually attacked. So for them, the risk is real. And therefore, not only the absence of risk reciprocity is not a new phenomenon and does not constitute drone specificity, but it is simplistic and false to speak of a war without risk, as drone opponents often do. The real specificity of the drone is not killing at a distance, it's permanence and knowledge. The consequence of the absence of human on board is endurance. Manned aircraft must refuel every 90 minutes or so, and due to pilot fatigue, they cannot perform long missions, 5 or 6 hours in general. By comparison, the latest version of the Reaper, equipped with additional tanks, can reach 49 hours. And Zephyr, a solar drone, 54. pushing the limits of endurance is one of the areas of research for UAVs of the future, with plans for solar UAVs and airships that will fly continuously for at least several years and possibly forever. Drones thus are revolutionizing aerial occupation, replacing the intermittent presence of aircrafts for specific missions with a permanent presence on certain zones. Persistence in flight is the first operational gain, and it is the true specificity of drones. Aerial occupation is new, and it constitutes a revolution not in the nature of war, but in its conduct. The advantage of this is that these permanently present drones, equipped with sensors, they produce knowledge. Having drones over an area, observing it closely for hours, days, weeks, helps identifying the target and its itineraries through the analysis of its patterns of life. From this point of view, the essential difference between the hundreds of cruise missiles that Clinton was launching on Afghanistan already in 1998 against bin Laden and Obama drones is that Clinton did not know who or what exactly he was firing at. Now that we know what the drone is and why it's special, we can answer normative questions, and I will start with the question of legality. Are drones legal? IHL, International Humanitarian Law, prohibits weapons that do not meet its general principles that are necessity, distinction, proportionality, precaution in the attack, prohibition of weapons causing unnecessary suffering. And there are two kinds of indiscriminate weapons. Ones which cannot be directed at a specific military objective, and ones which their effects cannot be limited. So the question is, can drones be directed at a military objective only, and can the effects be limited? My answer is yes and yes. The drone is not a weapon, it's a vehicle, possibly carrying a weapon, such as the Hellfire missile. And that Hellfire missile raises no debate when it is fired from a piloted plane like the F-15, although it is the exact same missile causing the exact same damage. The damage caused by drone missiles is modest compared to more destructive and nevertheless legal missiles and bombs. Weapons carried by drones thus do not violate IHR. They are even among the most accurate ever. It's easy to say that drones are imprecise because the lethal radius of the missiles is 15 to 20 meters. This kind of objection you find in Big Warshamai, for instance. But compare them with their alternatives. The Tomahawk missile, which in its standard version has a lethal radius of about 30 meters, or the GBU-12 laser-guided bombs with a blast radius of about 200 meters. Drone-fired missiles are much more precise. Above all, the fact that they are fired from a remote control device allows the operator, precisely because he's not risking his life, to take his time, to choose the right time, to cancel the shot at the last moment. If a civilian enters the area, it happened. And to do that not alone, contrary to widespread belief, to do that with a team, with the assistance of a legal advisor, and with the pressure that everything is recorded and could therefore be used against him later in case he commits IHL violations. Now, compare this environment with the one of soldiers on the ground, or even pilots in the air. Which one is better to respect IHR? It does not mean, of course, that drone operators do not make mistakes and do not kill innocent civilians in use of force in civilian-populated areas will. It means that drones have the potential to make much less collateral damage than other weapons. Therefore, the problem is not the weapon itself. The problem is the doctrine of employing it. The drone is a precise weapon. It can be, of course, used in an imprecise way, just as a needle can be used imprecisely. So before we discuss such a doctrine of employing it, that's the policy of targeted killings, we need to address a few objections about the drone as a means. Because even if it's not in itself illegal, even if it's more accurate, some people have concerns about, in particular, two things. The first is what the UN rapporteur called the PlayStation mentality, linked to the problem of the moral buffer. It says that it's easier to kill the drone because you're far from your target. You're secured in a bunker, and you see the whole thing through a screen, which has a video game-like interface. One says that drone operators, they don't have two barriers pilots usually face: the fear of being killed and the resistance to kill. And those, ironically called the cubicle warriors, would therefore be emotionally disconnected from the consequences of their actions. That is the argument. This interpretation is disproved by the fact that there are actually, as I told you, PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, among drone operators, mostly because of the confusion caused by the fact they're both at war and at home. They're not in a completely different context. They're not in Iraq or Afghanistan, where different rules apply, the rules of war. They live normal lives. They're driving home, they're talking to the kids about their homework, and while having killed targets just a few minutes before that times. And in order to help them to better disconnect their job and their personal life on the premise that the propensity to kill is proportional to the distance, and that seeing reality through the mediation of the machine is a kind of a moral buffer. As such, in abstracto, these theories are probably true. But first, this problem is not unique to the drone, as I already said. It is common to any distance weapon. And second, the specificity of the drones, their persistence and the knowledge they give reason to believe just the contrary. Even if, hypothetically, not seeing his victim would give a sense of irresponsibility, the difference between a drone operator and a bomber pilot is precisely that the former, unlike the latter, sees his victim. While increasing the physical distance between opponents, drones reduce the perceptual distance and what could be called the epistemic distance. Epistemic distance would be what we know about the other, which in that case is unilateral. It's what the operator knows about his target. It's not the other way around. The operator who spent weeks observing an individual is not exactly distant from him when it comes to killing. He's closer to him, not physically of course, but he's closer to him in terms of what he knows about him, his family, his habits, closer than any combatant on any ground battlefield, who can indeed make eye contact with his opponents, but knows nothing of his personality. Unlike other weapons operated remotely, the drone does not create anonymity. He creates identity. And 1,000 years of wars without screens, hence PlayStation effect, can testify that combatants are not more humane when they can see the enemy with their own eyes and feel his blood on their hands. For this reason, I do not believe in the PlayStation effect or the moral buffer objection. On the contrary, we have some reason to believe that a remote combatant, less exposed to risk, tends to less violate HR. Number of civilian casualties are caused by fear. Fear can make you trigger happy to protect yourself without taking time to check if you're facing a civilian, or if he's indeed directly participating in hostilities. The drone operator does not fear for his life. He can take his time, as I told already, and he can seek advice from a legal advisor. Another problem is the impact on the daily life of local people. The permanent presence of drones on certain zones where they fly 24/7 above communities in northern Pakistan, for instance, it has an impact on the daily lives of the population. Striking without warning houses and vehicles, they terrorize civilians, aware that they may be targeted at any time, and they are totally powerless against this threat from the sky. So you have consequences like parents preventing their children from going to school, people do not dare to travel in groups by fear of attracting attention. The drones are also preventing them sometimes from performing a number of cultural and religious practices, such as attending a meeting, funeral, going to a mosque, etc. They are also afraid to help victims of first strikes because it happened, unfortunately, that you have a second strike against the rescuers that is totally illegal in terms of IHR. That's a real problem that should be taken into account in the global assessment of the targeted killings legitimacy that we can do now. Is there someone on the line?
Yeah.
We don't know how to fix it.
The CIA and the FBI.
So targeted killings.
They want the full rationale for the army.
Targeted killings, we need a definition. Historically, targeted killings has always been present. States, of course, always denied it. It's only recently that certain states, Israel and the US, openly and officially adopted targeted killing policies. And there is no univocal definition of targeted killing under international law, but there is this good definition, I think, by Phil Alston, the former UN rapporteur. Targeted killing is the intentional, premeditated, and deliberate use of lethal force by states or their agents acting under color of law, or by an organized armed group in armed conflict against a specific individual who is not in the physical custody of the perpetrator. And contrary to extrajudicial execution, summary execution, and assassination, targeted killings are not, by definition, illegal. They may be illegal in exceptional circumstances of armed conflict. And with the exception of pacifists who condemned any use of force in principle, it's not surprising, because the ethical and legal position on targeted killings depends on the context, if it is or not in situations of armed conflict. For if you are in an armed conflict, targeting an enemy and killing him without warning, without trial, without judgment, is not exceptional. It's the norm. In peacetime, however, it is prohibited. And that moral evidence is reflected in the law. In the context of an armed conflict, targeted killing may be legal if the target is a combatant or a civilian participating actively in hostilities. I will get back to that difficult notion. Then the question is, for example, if the mere membership of an armed group is sufficient evidence of a direct participation in hostilities, and how long this participation lasts. In addition, to comply with IHL, the elimination must be necessary, proportional, and all precautions must be taken to avoid mistakes and minimize damage to civilians. These principles are customary law. It means that they apply regardless of the ratification of treaties and whether we are in an international or non-international armed conflict. In the absence of armed conflict, however, international human rights law applies. That's a different body of law. And the state is allowed to kill only if necessary to protect life, and if there is no other means, such as capture or neutralization, to prevent the threat. Targeted killing, in the sense of an intentional, premeditated, and deliberate murder, is illegal, because in that case, unlike in wartime, in peacetime it is never allowed to have the sole purpose to kill. It can happen as a consequence of an operation, police operation, but it cannot be the objective of the operation. When the killing is conducted on the territory of another state, which is often the case, there's also the issue of the violation of sovereignty. And here it's, I think, more simple than it is often said, because there is no violation of if the target states consents. And the US have secret agreements with states on whose territory they strike, even if, in the case of Pakistan, they deny it. So the crucial question, legally, is not the question of sovereignty. I believe it's whether we are or not in the context of an armed conflict. And the Americans know very well that this is the crux of the matter, because they have two programs. One official by the US Air Force, which hit in armed conflicts, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and is not problematic from an ethical or legal point of view. And the other, an official by the CIA that strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. And this one, of course, is much more controversial, because these theaters are not considered by observers as armed conflicts. But the first time the state publicly acknowledged the targeted killings policy was Israel in 2000. And it's good to explain the Israeli case, because you can see that there are many things in common with the US argumentation today. 2 years later, the Israeli Defense Force Judge Advocate General produced a legal opinion on the conditions under which Israel considered targeted killings to be legal. It said, first, that the Palestinian Authority ignores the request for arrest, that is primacy of capture. That the Israelis cannot stop the individual themselves, that is again primacy of capture. And third, that the elimination be conducted to prevent an imminent or future terrorist attack, not for revenge or retribution. It must be for future, not past. In 2006, the Israeli Supreme Court got involved making the first court decision on targeted killings. In that case, the first question was that of the status of terrorists. Are they combatants or civilians? The court considered that they are civilians, which means that IHL will allow killing them only if and as long as they take direct part in hostilities. So we need to prove that. That legal notion of direct participation in hostility is central to understand the normative debate on targeted killings. When civilians directly participate in hostilities, they lose their protection and they can therefore be treated as combatants. In other words, during the period of their direct participation in hostilities, they can be subject to direct attacks, exactly as if they were lawful combatants. This concept was introduced in 1977 Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, is the subject of controversy. So the ICRC sought clarification by issuing that interpretative guidance in 2010. It's not, of course, a binding text. It is the ICRC opinion, but it's useful to interpret this notion. Its purpose is to determine when and for how long a person is deemed to have lost the protection against direct attack. In order to qualify as direct participation in hostility, the specific act must meet the following cumulative criteria. So there are 3 of them. The first one is that the act must be likely to adversely affect the military operations or military capacity of a party to an armed conflict, or alternatively to inflict death, injury, or destruction on persons or objects protected against direct threat. So you have to meet a certain threshold of harm. If you're in a armored vehicle and you're facing someone that is just throwing rocks on you, the threshold of harm is not reached. 2, there must be a direct causal link between the act and the harm likely to result either from that act or from a coordinated military operation of which that act constitutes an integral part. That is direct causation. Indirect participation is something else. Giving food, bringing food to the military is considered indirect participation, for instance. The transportation of munitions, it's more complicated because it depends where you are transporting them. 3, the act must be specifically designed to directly cause the required threshold of harm in support of a party to the conflict and to the detriment of another. Any violent act in the context of an armed conflict is not related to the armed conflict. You can take that opportunity to, act for private matters. So you need that belligerent nexus. So that is the ICRC interpretation that is kind of conventional. But the Israeli Supreme Court has a different interpretation and broader interpretation. It extends the conventional interpretation in 2 ways. First, in discussing the directness. Direct participation, they say, should not be narrowed merely to the person committing the physical act of attack. Those who have sent him as well take a direct part. The same goes for the person who decided upon the act and the person who planned it. It's not to be said about them that they are taking an indirect part in the hostilities. Second, they are broadening it in discussing the duration. A civilian who has joined a terrorist organization which has become his home and in the framework of his role in that organization commits a chain of hostilities with short periods of rest between them, loses his immunity from attack for such time as he is committing the chain of acts. Indeed, regarding such a civilian, the rest between hostilities is nothing other than preparation for the next hostility. The problem, of course, is that the rest periods are not quantified. Is it days, is it weeks, months, years between each hostile action? Then it becomes possible to target a suspected terrorist at any time. And that's the goal of such an interpretation, of course. The first enlargement that you see here of what constitutes direct participation is acceptable, I believe. It is understandable. After all, if it was enough to not carry weapons yourself, not to be regarded as directly participating in hostilities, leaders who command but do not conduct attacks themselves could never be targeted for actions they are responsible for. But the second enlargement, though, that duration, a civilian loses his immunity, is more problematic. Since it is no longer necessary to base the attack on what the suspected terrorist is doing, that is his behavior, that is the traditional interpretation, only on what he is supposed to be, that is his status. And it's to say, on the mere fact of being a member of a terrorist organization. Of course, the problem is that such a membership is difficult to prove, because these organizations do not issue membership cards. In such a context, the burden of proof is also a problem, because it's always harder for a suspected terrorist to prove he does not belong than to prove he does. Such an interpretation makes the direct participation, hence the legitimacy of the civilian target, rely not on his behavior, nor the imminence of an attack, but on a supposed affiliation. And this is very dangerous because it encourages killing as a first and not a last resort, when it will be possible to neutralize or negotiate. And it also maximizes the risk of killing an innocent and making collateral civilian casualties. Now the US. US policy was not immediately official, unlike the Israeli. But it was so obvious that it became so after huge media pressure around April 2012, when President Obama officially recognized it. And to better understand the American position and the ethical and legal issues it raises, we can rely on that document, even if it's a bit particular. It was leaked to the press in 2013. It's about the conditions under which the targeted killing of an American citizen, and that's why it is particular. An Al-Qaeda or associated forces operative is considered legal and legitimate. So we should not rely too much on this document, as it deals with the specific issue of an American citizen. Obama asked for a legal opinion before targeting and killing Anwar al-Awlaki in September 2011, because this Yemeni was also an American, dual citizen. And because this document is about targeting Americans, we can assume that its standards are higher because of constitutional obligations issues, and that as far as non-Americans are concerned, we can suspect that standards are probably more relaxed. The US government believes that it is the lawful act of self-defense, so we are here in a certain interpretation of Article 51, to three conditions. First, where an informed high-level official of the US government has determined that the targeted individual poses an imminent threat of violent attack against the US, so imminence. Two, primacy of capture, same thing than before in the Israeli case, where a capture operation would be infeasible and where those conducting the operation continue to monitor whether capture becomes feasible. And third, where such an operation would be conducted consistent with IHL. So the number 2 and 3 you find already in the Israeli 2006 decision. Some of these policies were repeated in the famous Obama speech of May 2013, when he said, he said as well in that speech that he would cancel the CIA program, and now all the targeted killings would be done by the US Air Force only. But of course it's not happening. It's not happening for bureaucratic reasons, and because it's pragmatically very advantageous to keep this clandestine program. So he said about the justification that the US will conduct strikes only against individuals who pose an imminent threat to the American people, near certainty that no civilians will be killed, etc. So you see the same criteria. Point number 3 before here is already an answer to that earlier distinction that we made between being in the context of an armed conflict or not. Because if you're relying on the laws of war, if you're invoking IHL, it means that you're in the context of an armed conflict. And indeed, the US believe they are currently in a non-international armed conflict with Al-Qaeda, and that, of course, can be discussed. Therefore, for them, IHL, not international human rights law, apply. And from that point of view, and even if President Obama has long disavowed the paradigm of a global war on terror, he quickly caught up, and his administration is now in a strict continuity of the Bush administration. When Leon Panetta said, we're in a war on terrorism, and we've been in that war since 9/11, it was particularly clear. And this position, of course, is obviously challenged inside and outside the US. Many argue that the US apply IHL, the right to kill, to situations that are not armed conflicts. Most legal experts believe that there is no armed conflict in the strict sense, and that this war against terrorism is a new manner of speaking, and therefore IHL does not apply. There would be actually a better case for considering US actions as part of a legitimate non-international armed conflict. An alternative argumentation. When the US acts as a party to an already existing armed conflict between a local government and the local armed groups. For instance, between the Pakistan and the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, between Yemen and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Akkad. In such a case, you can say that US actions fall within IHL. But there are two conditions, though. That the fighting between the government and the armed group meet the threshold for an armed conflict. There is a threshold in terms of violence in the case of non-international armed conflict that you don't have in the case of international armed conflict. And that the armed group has the capacity and organization to abide by the laws of war. Organization is the second criterion for being qualified as a non-international armed conflict. And that's the case for both Pakistan and Yemen in recent years. So you can say they are facing non-international armed conflicts, NIAC situations. However, so that is theoretically possible to have that line of argumentation. But it's not the US line of defense. It's not how they argue. They say that there is a NIAC between them and the local armed group, Al-Qaeda and associated forces, and that they intervene to defend US interests, not the local government's interests. And such an argumentation, of course, is weaker, legally speaking, because there is no global, there is no global territory on which you can have a non-international armed conflict. It's supposed to be on a given territory. So it's legally weaker than the one I just proposed, but it is politically more acceptable because you want here, either from Pakistan, from Yemen, or even from the US, the kind of argumentation that I just proposed. The element is the personal scope with the notion of associated forces. That is the vocabulary we used by Brennan, first in a speech at Harvard in 2011. The US authorized itself to include not only members of Al-Qaeda, but also various groups in Yemen, or the Al-Shabaab in Somalia, or other associated forces. And that concept is ambiguous, and that concept can be interpreted in two ways. You can have a narrow interpretation that may be okay, if we're talking about groups actually associated with Al-Qaeda that have therefore a joint responsibility in the attacks against the US interests since 2001, then you would need to show that Akkad, for instance, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, that was established in 2009, that is well after September 2001, actually coordinated attacks against the US. And it is the case because the Yemeni American citizen al-Awlaki was an Akkad leader, and the link was made with a plot to bomb cargo planes from Yemen to the US. So in that case it works, but in other cases, maybe not. And the problem is that you can interpret these associated forces in a broader sense. And then it would cover any person or group inspired by the speeches of Osama bin Laden, for instance, even in the absence of any tangible link. And this broad interpretation, of course, is more problematic. Then, as says Amnesty International in the title of its report on the white paper, the devil is in the details, we should return to the three above conditions to discuss them. The first one, remember, was imminence. That requirement of imminence, that the individual must be an imminent threat, gives rise to divergent interpretations. And that's not new, because the problem of defining imminence is a traditional issue in just war theory, more specifically when talking about preemptive or preventive wars. When is the threat really imminent? How to ensure that our early response comes neither too early nor too late? And international law is of no help here because there is no consensual definition of imminence. It's a vague concept. And of course, politics take advantage of such a vagueness. The official position of the US government, which is not unanimous, of course, I'll get back to that in the conclusion, is a broad interpretation of imminence. That this condition does not require that the government is aware that a specific attack will take place in the immediate future. It can therefore target people who are planning attacks in the long term or vague, non-specified attacks. Even if an Al-Qaeda member is not currently preparing for future attacks, the very fact that it is associated in one way or another to Al-Qaeda makes an imminent threat of him. And therefore, for the US government at least, a legitimate target. You recognize here the same broadening of the definition that we saw in the Israeli case. Exactly the same thing. And which amounts to the abandon of the traditional criterion of imminence, replaced by affiliation. Second point was primacy of capture rather than elimination. It's of course reaffirmed repeatedly by Obama and his administration, but it's rarely practiced. Captures outside Afghanistan are very rare. It's not impossible. We saw that in Tripoli in Libya last year, but it's very rare. Most of the time, targets are killed in very remote areas where the US and its allies simply would not have the ability to capture them. And use of drones rather than special forces on the ground doesn't help, of course, since it's almost impossible to capture with a drone. I'm saying almost impossible, but not impossible, contrary to another widespread belief in what you find in Edward Chamayou, for instance, as well, because it happened. There is one very famous and historic example. In 1991, at that time, drones were not armed, where Iraqi soldiers surrendered to an unarmed Pioneer surveillance drone. Because these Iraqi soldiers, they saw that each time they saw these Pioneer drones, surveillance drones, not long after there were jets coming and striking them. So this time they decided to prevent the next action, and they waved white flags at the drone camera, and some ground troops picked them up later.
So they surrendered to the drone.
They're surrounded to the drone operator, you can say.
That's good.
But you know, it's a kind of unique case that is.
But maybe that's the way of the future.
Well, at least it shows that technically it's not impossible, contrary to that widespread belief. But of course, you can say it's more difficult to surrender to a drone than to.
And then we could imagine drones which could pick up the people who have surrendered and bring them back home, you know, to the US base.
Yes, yes. Why not? Like transport drones.
Yes, yes, yes. I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, maybe. So it's not the best way to capture, but at least it's you have an option that you don't have with the Tomahawk missile. And the third was compliance with the principles of IHL. Remember, necessity, distinction, proportionality, and precaution. And that compliance depends on the method used. And in the case, the method used is drones. I already answered this in the first part. There is no problem, potentially speaking, for drones to be able to respect IHL. So the conclusion of this quick inventory is that not only the qualification of armed conflict, so the applicability of IHL is debatable, but also the doctrine itself, especially the notions of imminence and associated forces, for instance. Now the moral debate. With my argument, which is largely consequentialist, as you can understand already, I think that the use of armed drones in some situations and under certain conditions produces better consequences for all the people concerned, meaning not only us, the intervening power, but also them, the local civilians. That's the main problem, is the problem of civilian casualties. And no one disputes that drones make civilian casualties, collateral damage. It is inevitable. Any weapon used in some densely populated civilian area will kill civilians. The debate is rather on the number of civilians killed, more exactly on their proportion. You have various reports, and when you look at these various reports, they show an amazing gap in numbers. From what I saw, 15% of civilian casualties in certain reports, up to 90%. So who's right? The problem is that these numbers are unverifiable. They are unverifiable for several reasons. The first being that these strikes take place in very remote areas where central governments have little or no control. So there is simply no one to count the dead. There is simply no one to distinguish between combatants and civilians. The second reason is that victims are buried quickly in accordance with Muslim tradition. The third, that there are some manipulations. We saw the Taliban, for instance, burying combatants and leaving the civilians in the open. This methodological problem of counting the dead is well documented. There is an interesting report from Columbia Law School, 2012, I believe, on that subject. And you see each part in the conflict adjusting his estimate to his argument. Islamist groups overestimate, they speak of hundreds of civilians dead per year, and the US government underestimates. The most obvious underestimation was in 2010 and 2011, when Brennan said that in this year, between June and June, there had been, I quote, no civilian casualties, zero. So all we know is that the truth lies somewhere in between these several hundreds and zero, but we cannot have any accurate number. But it's not a big deal, it's not a problem, because the argument is not here. The ethical argument in favor of drones is not that they are not making civilian casualties. It's not even that they are making a few civilian casualties. It is that they are making less civilian casualties than other weapons, and that is different. There's no point in waving figures on number of civilian killed, because they cannot prove all the figures that you can find. They cannot prove that the drones are not, all things considered, the least lethal means of conducting this fight. So my argument is not absolutist. I'm not saying that drone strikes are intrinsically good. It's relativist. I'm saying that they're a lesser evil. Take Pakistan, for instance. The question is what would replace drones if they did not exist, or if we were to stop using them tomorrow. The first option would be infantrymen. Grégoire Chamayou is saying let's have a ground operation because it's supposed to be more discriminate. And that remains to be seen. And anyway, it's not very likely. It's not very likely because of a famous trend in the evolution of warfare, casualty aversion. Like in drones, Americans would not have invaded Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. Instead, they would have fired missiles and dropped bombs, as they did before they had drones in these areas. Or they would have waited until the problem called for a larger-scale air campaign, like Kosovo. And in that case, it would not be one drone strike every 4 days to complain about. It would be something like 10,484 strikes in 78 days, as was Serbia in 1999, and that's more than 134 strikes per day. But let's play this game for the sake of this argument. If we did replace the drone by a ground operation, the question is, would that really be better for the civilians? At least two recent examples that are difficult to ignore, Iraq and Afghanistan, show how much bad ground strategy can be disastrous for the civilian population. Obama's stealth strategy, the trio of drones, special forces, and cyber warfare, is a reaction against Bush's global war. Its purpose is precisely to move beyond the era of large deployments, which, in my opinion, will not happen again, which are very harmful both to the occupants in human, financial, and political costs to the occupied. And this movement away from invasion to sporadic drone strikes reduces the level of violence for everyone. So if a ground invasion is not an option, is there a better alternative than the drones? Can it be simply nothing? Chamayou is saying that. No military action at all. It is, of course, naive to think that if the US wouldn't have drones, they wouldn't have intervened at all with other means. But for the sake of the argument again, let's accept the hypothesis that without drones, there would have been no American intervention in these areas. The question is then, would that really have been better for the civilians? In fact, the American actions would not have been replaced by a gaping void, letting terrorism prosper in the region. They would have been replaced by operations that already complemented actions by Pakistani forces. For example, from the end of 2008 to the end of 2010, the Pakistan Air Force made more than 5,500 sorties and dropped 10,000 bombs on more than 4,000 targets in the northwest tribal areas, what we call Waziristan. There were many casualties of these operations, and it's even likely that some of the casualties attributed to American drones were in fact casualties of Pakistani aircraft. For village witnesses, blaming drones contained some incoherencies, and that you see in the October 2013 report from Amnesty International, when you have a testimony of a villager explaining that he saw drones flying in pairs, sometimes 3 together, and they were making a loud sound. That behavior is the behavior of F-16, used by F-16 or other planes, but in that case, I believe it's F-16, used by the Pakistani military. Drones are not flying in pairs. It's very difficult to do. It's something for the future drones. And they're not making a loud sound. So Some strikes falsely attributed to American drones are probably done, conducted by the Pakistani military. But in the mind of certain villagers, everything falling from the sky should be from American drones. Moreover, it's not only about Air Force. Pakistani forces conduct major ground offensive. So you want ground operations, you have with the Pakistanis. And they cause large population displacements. Remember the second battle of Swat in 2009, between April and July. They killed nearly 2,000 people and displaced 3.4 million. There is no evidence, to my knowledge, that drones have this perverse effect. Drones don't do that. Amnesty International's report on drone strikes in Pakistan, will I be next, the report I was just talking about, in October 2013, reports that every week the Pakistan Army uses indiscriminate weapons, firing mortars on villages, dropping unguided bombs in places where combatants and civilians mingle, etc. They even have a specific report on that army's abuses, thousands of extrajudicial executions, arbitrary detentions, and torture of men and children. That is the Pakistani army. Drone strikes have to be compared to not nothing and not to peace. They have to be compared to these imprecise weapons and brutal methods of the Pakistan army because that is their alternative. Obviously, peace is preferable to drone strikes, but if they were to stop tomorrow, peace would not descend on Waziristan. Insurgents would still mount their attacks as they had before the appearance of drones. Drones did not trigger anything. And the Pakistani Taliban would still want to overturn the government. The only difference would be that Pakistani forces will redouble their efforts to conduct more anti-Taliban operations. What the Amnesty reports unintentionally demonstrate is that actually there are far fewer civilian casualties of American drones than of the armed groups that they are fighting against, and of the Pakistan army, which is also conducting operations against those groups. However, by taking the absolutist position of denouncing everyone, denouncing the armed groups, the Pakistan army and the American drones, Amnesty can express indignation about the civilian casualties of drones without noticing the relationship to the others. Because Amnesty's point is simply that it is wrong. And against this attitude seemingly generous, but in fact supporting a policy that would maximize the misery, I would appeal to Raymond Aron's realistic observation that politics is never a conflict between good and evil, but always a choice between the preferable and the detestable. It is always so, especially in foreign policy. In the case in hand, this means that one cannot consider two evils equally reprehensible if removing the lesser one means strengthening the greater one. Stopping the drone strikes would encourage the Pakistan army to conduct more operations and to produce many more civilian casualties than are currently produced by American drones. This point seems relatively clear. However, there are other issues in the consequentialist approach that are more difficult to resolve, like the calculation of efficiency. Are drone strikes reducing the security threat, or on the contrary, increasing it? In other words, do drones really make the US safer? This calculation uses the following criteria. First, the impact on Al-Qaeda. On the one hand, drones eliminate terrorists and therefore weaken certain networks, but not all of them are important. It is estimated that only 2% of victims are high-level targets. Even if immediately replaced, these leaders are affected by the strikes, which disorganize the network, put the leaders on the run, stress them, etc. Bin Laden writings found after his death confirmed that he deplored the impact of drone strikes and recommended leaders to leave Waziristan to find safer havens. But on the other hand, the correlation between drone strikes and the decline of Al-Qaeda activity is not proven. The link is not necessarily causal because it is multifactorial, the Al-Qaeda decline. Moreover, the dispersal of Al-Qaeda away from Waziristan in other regions, like the Sahel, in Africa, or the Middle East, is problematic. It may be not a good thing. The impact on the civilian population is another criterion. That negative impact that I already talked about earlier of these drones on the population. It is an effective tool for recruitment and motivation of the armed groups. Obama's drones, from this point of view, have the same perverse effect, negative effect, than Guantanamo had for Bush. They have become symbols of the American oppression, imperialism, whatever. But we have to be careful here, not to simplify the problem. Not all local population is against drone strikes. It all depends on their frequency and the government propaganda. And Yemen and Pakistan are very different in that respect. Another criterion to take into account is the impact on bilateral relations, because drone strikes affected the cooperation between the US and Pakistan, making anti-terrorist cooperation more difficult, therefore less effective. Another criterion is the impact on international peace and security, because, as we saw, the legality of these strikes is at best questionable when the targets are not related to September 11 attacks, for instance, or do not pose an immediate threat to American security. Therefore, you can say that these strikes are dangerous precedents that could be invoked by other powers in the future, especially if the benefits of drones, their low cost, their autonomy, is endurance is great, the ability to penetrate enemy lines discreetly and safely, etc. All these benefits, advantages, could encourage states to conduct armed operations they would not have conducted otherwise. In other words, the question is to know if drones are the destabilizing factor. There are two interesting directions here. That's the question of proliferation. First, states. What happens when the Chinese will use drones, you can ask, to strike Uyghur on their own territory or in Kazakhstan? What happens when the Indians will do the same in Kashmir, Russians in Caucasus, or Turks in Kurdistan? The second point is that proliferation also presents the risk that the technology falls into the hands of non-state actors. And I believe that the main risk in terms of proliferation is about non-state actors more than states, even if China is currently producing very cost-efficient drones, like a copy of the Reaper for $1 million. That is approximately 17 times less than the American original. And that can contribute greatly to the state proliferation. But think that Hezbollah already have drones supplied by Iran, Ababil, Iranian drones since 2006. Israel destroyed half of them, but they can be used. They can be used, and that's the real danger, to the modified bombs. Therefore, it's very difficult to take into account all consequences in the consequentialist calculus. Not only civilian casualties, I believe this is clear, even if it's the biggest problem, to assess the global efficiency of drone strikes. It means that it's in the best interest of the American government to reevaluate its use of drones, and I believe it did that already, taking into consideration in its utilitarian calculus these indirect arms. And even if this consequentialist approach has problems, as you can see, I still believe it's the most adequate to assess drone strikes' legitimacy. Let's have a look to another interesting approach, virtue ethics. What bothers about drone strikes, the moral malaise that is noticeable not only in the public debate but also in the military, is neither a principled opposition that would be deontologism, nor a calculation of the efficiency that would be consequentialism, what we just saw. It is the kind of combatant we want to be, and that's virtue ethics. The problem for drone opponents, basically saying that it's not war but assassination, is not so much that there are collateral civilian victims, because there are in any war. It's the fact we are making such collateral victims without taking ourselves any physical risk. What's bothering them is the absence of reciprocity that we talked about earlier, the fact it is too easy. And a good example of that, how present is the virtue ethics approach when talking about drones and targeted killings in the debate, is the so-called drone medal affair. When the then Defense Secretary Leon Panetta announced the creation of an award for service members who remotely launch unmanned military strikes or cyber attacks, and explained at that time that such a distinction would rank higher than the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart, associations of veterans immediately protested on the grounds that, I quote, "There's a fundamental difference between those who fight remotely or via computer and those fighting against an enemy who is trying to kill them." And the Pentagon later suspended the new military medal. What this drone medal affair reveals is that prestige and military values are still closely linked to the risk taken. That's why many consider drone strikes as a cowardice. What can we answer to such a critique? It's more difficult. First, that such moral indignation again is not new. Killing remotely has always produced moral indignation. Remember the prohibition of the crossbow in the 1129 Lateran Council. The consequences of Welsh bows at the Battle of Crecy in 1326. Firearms, artillery, submarines, airplanes, they all provoked moral indignation and controversies, and it's very interesting from a historical point of view to check the archives during this time. Second, that such an indignation today is based on an outdated premise. War is not conventional anymore. It is no longer a Clausewitzian frontal impact. It is not a duel and should not be thought of as if it was one. Those who seem to lament that no more die at war have a romantic conception of war that lacks an important and ancient step. We are now in a post-heroic age. So there is a gap between the perception of what war should be and the reality of what it became. The perception is still based on the symmetrical model of conventional war, two armies in a battlefield. The reality is that war is irregular and asymmetric. It's now based on the avoidance of the frontal impact. And most of the time, the enemy are not traditional combatants in uniforms and battalions. They are deterritorialized, non-state actors, part-time civilian bombers. In that respect, drone strikes, you can see them as an asymmetric response to an asymmetric threat. Third, even from a virtue ethics point of view, there's a conflict of virtues. Courage is not the only military virtue. Honor is another one, which is evidenced in respect of jus in bello, that is, respect of IHL principles. And what if these two virtues are incompatible? Pakistani soldiers are braver than American drone operators when they're conducting their ground operations in Waziristan, because they take risk, they're risking their lives. But which of the two is the most honorable? Which better respects IHL? If using a drone is more discriminating and causes less collateral damage than a ground invasion, what's more important? The courage of soldiers showing little honor, or the honor of soldiers showing little courage? Being a consequentialist, my criterion is the harm caused to individuals having interests. It's not virtues, as if they had an intrinsic value. I don't care that the soldier is found less courageous if he makes less civilian casualties. Conclusion: US government lawyers are divided on the practice of targeted killings. Harold Coe, for example, who was until January 2013 legal advisor of the State Department and is now back at Yale University, has a narrow interpretation. Targeted killing is legal only against high-value targets, only when they're actually plotting against the US, and only when the threat is specific enough to invoke self-defense. Other Pentagon lawyers defend a broader interpretation, of course. For them, the fact that we are in a war on terror allows to target even low-value militants, and even if they are not actually engaged in preparation for an attack. So even if there is no specific threat. That's the important difference between personality strikes based on the known identity of the target and signature strikes based on behavioral patterns. Signature strikes replace an epistemology of clear observation and judgment of fact with an epistemology of suspicion, in which the targeting decision is based on the recognition of conduct or a life profile, indicating a presumed state of membership in a hostile organization, which naturally increases the chance of striking the innocent. This development in American strategy in Pakistan is regrettable. It was a major change when the CIA broadened its targeting, no longer aiming exclusively at high-value targets, but any group of suspected militants on the basis of presumably questionable behavior. Increasing these signature strikes led to many errors, such as attacking a group of 17 men simply because they were seen training, doing push-ups and running, and attacking an individual simply because he had twice met with men in his car and has changed cars 3 times in a day. These deviations and the industrialization of targeted killings that such deviations are symptoms of are clearly reprehensible, and the American government has in fact backed off, as you can see in this evolution since 2010. However, they show not these deviations, these problems. They show not that the drone is an imprecise weapon again. They show that it can be used in an imprecise way with signature strikes. Provided that we do not confuse the thing with its use, it is quite possible to condemn the abuses of a permissive policy such as signature strikes without calling into question the principle of targeted killings itself and use of drones. That has been done by Michael Walter, for instance, who criticizes the excessive use of drones and the abuses of signature strikes without throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And I believe it's a wise conclusion, and it's a conclusion that should inspire the French doctrine when we will arm our drones. Thank you.